I'm Lindsay Lewis, editor of Building Enclosure. Thanks for listening along with us today. I'm honored to be joined today by our 2025 Leadership Award winner, Stevan Vinci. Stevan is here today to tell us about himself so our audience can learn more about him and celebrate his win with him. Congrats again, Stevan, and welcome.
Yeah, thank you very much. Happy to be here.
So to get started, can you tell us about yourself, what your job title is, what company you're with, what do you do in the AEC industry?
Sure. So current job title now is I'm the technical lead for the Building Enclosure group over at GluMac. So big MEP design firm that also has a consultancy aspect, sort of a building science group. So we fit kind of in there. And so I've been doing strictly sort of building envelope, building enclosure, consulting, commissioning, as well as with an eye on sustainability, focus on sort of those high performance building types for just over the past 25 years. So it's a very exciting thing. Fortunate enough to work on projects, started my career up in Canada, moved down to the US. So fortunate enough to work on, projects across both Canada, the US, some international projects as well, all climate zones, everything. So a lot of variation, a lot of excitement comes with that too.
Well, you brought up your background a little bit, but I want to ask what first sparked your passion for building science and sustainability?
Yeah. So, college-wise, I started out as, mechanical engineering program and, focused on sort of, the traditional mechanical engineering approaches and things like that. I got started early on with some internships and, some summer jobs focusing on a lot of sort of forensic investigations, some building envelope condition assessments that got me trained early on doing a lot of thermographic scans. So that got me hooked on the complexities of just the building enclosure, right? It's kind of that mix of thermodynamics and material science, which were basically my two favorite subjects within that mechanical engineering program. And then, from that sustainability aspect, I had a lot of early mentors in my career that were focused on sustainability. Was fortunate enough, while my career in Canada, got involved with LEED and the Canada Green Building Council early on, on a lot of early LEED projects in Canada, as well as being one of the lead reviewers for the CEGBC. So it dipped my toe kind of like, baptism by fire within the sustainability realm. And just, that aspect and complexity of thinking from the building enclosure does a lot more than just keeping, rain out of your building, keeping, the cold out, and adding in a bit of that additional sort of synergies related to sustainability from energy, material choices, things like that, really just stoke the fire, keeps me in this every day.
Now, with all these complex projects that you've worked on, is there maybe one that has left a lasting impression on you? Can you talk about any of them?
Obviously some of the ones that do have those high performance requirements early on, like we're targeting net zero living building challenge, they're very strict. They've set that line in the sand early on. But I think some of the projects that I think back on the most are some of those ones where they didn't really have any goals. Like think of those, code minimum mentality, right? And sort of like in the background, it's kind of like, I know they're just not doing much, but like we can work with their budgets, with their sort of strategies and systems. And like, let's improve that performance, both from, energy perspective, air tightness wise, and look at some more sustainable material choices, which a lot of people, when they hear that word sustainability, like that's a language, right? So some of the common material choices that are out there when you look at envelope assemblies actually are, meet those red list free, lower embodied carbon, things like that. So it's kind of like keeping an eye on those to include in. So you've basically taken sort of that code minimum project and basically increased that performance, gave it a bit more resiliency, a bit more durability, kind of behind the scenes without kind of waving a flag saying you're doing it. It's just kind of like, we're going to do this for this client.
Now, you mentioned people who have mentored you over the years, but you've also mentored many students and professionals. So what's a piece of advice you wish someone had given you earlier in your career?
I think it's a lot of, earlier in the career, you always start out somewhere low on the sort of rung on the ladder, right? And, you may be stuck with doing a lot of, you know, building condition assessments. Sometimes people get stuck with doing like some condominium, like reserve studies and things like that. But just to realize that a lot of those early, what people think is sort of like the bottom of the bucket tasks are going to start to inform, um, your practice as you get further on. I always kind of been like, oh, I got to go do another assessment, and things like that. But it's kind of like, a lot of those existing building issues start to inform what you would start to look like from a risk perspective or even design, when you start looking at new construction, right? So each of these little learning things, like look at it with like eyes wide open because it's trying to put a bigger piece of the puzzle together. And it's also looking at it that, building enclosure, we've always looked at it as just sort of that environmental separation. But think of it, if you look at a building holistically from an energy systems perspective, start thinking of the building enclosure as sort of like that's your passive mechanical system, sort of say. So, it's actually contributing from an energy perspective. You're adding resilience to it. So, if you start to think you're getting a bit pigeonholed or stuck in a rut somewhere, it's looking at that bigger picture. And one piece of advice too, sometimes you look at it and say like, oh, I want to start working on some of those projects, and you can't get there unless you get some experience. I try to tell some younger staff and even students that, if you're really passionate about it, you're not going to become an expert, between the hours of like 9 and 5. So if you're very passionate about it and you're really interested, start reading up on it. There's things you can do, on your own time. These days there's a lot of very informative, very great webinars that are free, right? There's a lot of learning that you can do on your own time. And that's how you basically advance your career.
That's very true. So you've also spoken at conferences around the world. So is there presentations that you've given that have been maybe your favorite ones to give? Can you talk about some of the presentations that you've given?
Yeah, I've given presentations at, both the local conferences, even just, the local building enclosure council stuff, the monthly things like that, and even on the national conference stage. And, the ones that are great are sort of, when you're speaking to the crowd and you kind of see the people like, getting these kind of like aha moments, it's a lot of the times you look into a presentation, you're given, a half hour, 45 minutes, to have questions at the end, but, it's never trying to wow everybody for the whole time. There's going to be a few aha moments in there. I think, some of the most memorable presentations, there was one, kind of at, an AIA conference one time where we brought up sort of the notion of like accounting for all, lineal and point thermal bridges and just illustrating like how much energy loss is actually through that. Sometimes people look at it from that 1 and 2D perspective, but when you look at it from a 3D perspective, seeing where that heat flow and energy loss is. So getting some of that and just, there's been some presentations where you're sitting there, you give the presentation, and then you kind of have a collective, like 1 or 2 people for that discussion later on that ends up being a longer discussion than the presentation you just gave, right? So those are the ones, it's more of the things where maybe you gave somebody an aha moment and that follow-up discussion, because sometimes that follow discussion inspires me to like, I should think of this the next time I give that presentation to iterate on some of these other interesting points.
Mhm. Yeah, well, speaking on collaboration, I was able to read through your bio as we were looking through all the nominees, which was, I do want to say for our listeners, was very hard this year. Every year gets harder and harder, which is a good thing because we have so many great nominees that come in through the industry. But reading about you, it seems that collaboration was pretty central to your leadership style. So I want to ask, what's one quality you value most in the teams that you lead or work with?
I think a lot of it has to come down with like always having an open mind, right? Like sometimes, you're brought into some teams or even within your group, right? And so, trying to keep people like sort of not siloed, like maybe this guy is, the energy specialist or something like that, but like looking at it from like holistically, like you're all trying to get to the same goal, and looking at it from, the value in teams and even leadership is sort of like keeping sort of that flat structure, like nobody is above anybody else on that team, right? So treating everybody with respect, listening to what they have to say, because there is a lot of trade-off, being an enclosure consultant and specialist within an MEP firm, right? There's a lot of sort of that gray area where nobody, typically on projects, the envelope consultant isn't part of the MEP firm or team. So there's always that kind of like somebody's not translating between those two areas. And sometimes a lot of value could be had with a lot of that discussion, right? So, keeping that open lines of communication, I think, valuing everybody there really brings teams together, right? They have a more vested interest in a project or a policy or strategy or something you're trying to do within your own firm. Having people have that vested interest gets the best out of everyone.
Now, I was also reading that you are part of USGBC's Lead Energy and Atmosphere Technical Advisory Group, where you played a role in shaping Lead V5. So, can you tell us a little bit about that experience?
Yeah, it was a great and kind of exhausting process. It started a few years ago, and I can't like express how amazing both like the USGBC, like the tag, like the staff and tag members, providing guidance, having that open conversation, listening to each other's experience and expertise, trying to bring that whole package together, right? Because in the EA tag, we're looking at sort of like that decarbonization aspect, increasing energy efficiency. You're always trying to, lead as a leader in the market, and you're not trying to make it out of reach to everybody. You're trying to reach as many people in there. So there's, a bit of that discussion, like, do we go really far with this, or do we make it, what's achievable to a lot of the, not just across the US, leads used across the world. So it's looking at it from a perspective of like, if this makes sense here, does it make sense in markets like Asia or South America or even Europe, right? So there's that a bit of balance there. Working with that group, from a building enclosure perspective, I was very happy to see that, there are additional requirements related to the building enclosure commissioning that are included in version 5 that, even from the prerequisite perspective that I thought were missing in version 4, right? So it's basically what we're doing with version 5 is aligning what's included in a lot of local codes, that follow sort of the ASHRAE 90.1 energy code perspective, because there is, enclosure commissioning included with that. So we're trying to align, in V5 from a prerequisite perspective of what some local codes actually are asking for. And then, as we get into the enhanced, aligning with, an industry standard that people are familiar with that ASTM, E2947. And even further from that, in the energy and atmosphere credits, adding other requirements related to enclosure performance. So when you look at V5, there's a reduction in peak thermal loads. So it's better performance related to air leakage, as well as looking at accounting for thermal bridging related to sort of the 2022 version of ASHRAE 90.1. It's in there to help with sort of the demand spikes from peak heating and cooling, trying to be good grid citizens, but it's also adding a bit of that passive survivability to buildings, because, equipment and everything is getting quite efficient. So like trying to improve on performance, we're starting to look away from just mechanical upgrades and performance, right? And starting to pay attention to, that building envelope, right? It's that artistic expression of the architect, but we're making it very energy efficient and very resilient.
And you're located in Oregon, correct?
Yes.
Can you talk a little bit about some of the local energy initiatives you've been working on out there?
Yeah. So, there's been a few things. Ben's quite, trying to push sort of the, move the needle a lot from a sustainability or energy efficiency perspective. The City of Bend actually has a community climate action plan. It's a voluntary plan, but it's making it look like it's achievable, scalable, not just for city projects, but just projects within the city itself, right? It's looking at sort of that decarbonization aspect, reducing, the need on fossil fuels. So it's, what we try to do with that is, looking at it both from a new construction perspective and even existing buildings, right? So they're looking at improving energy efficiency in both those building types, helping some existing buildings. A lot of existing building owners have sort of their, deferred maintenance sort of budgets and things like that. So it's kind of educating them on looking at it like, okay, you have this deferred maintenance budget and you're allocating it here, but let's take that money and we could use it this way, still improve on that stuff, but like we could drastically improve it from energy efficiency, resiliency, air tightness. Like we're kind of, throughout the summer here in Bend, it's always like, when does forest fire and fire smoke season start, right? So a lot of people end up, maybe not being able to go to work or go to school because, of air quality, and you're stuck in your own homes, even if you live in apartment buildings and things like that. If they're very leaky as well, like, is it even healthy to stay at home, right? So it's like, could we improve on air tightness, especially on some existing buildings, especially in new construction, right? To keep sort of that, you're able to shelter in place, be healthy, things like that. So, it's looking at that, improving that passive aspect because, to be honest, like blindly just switching old fossil fuel equipment to heat pumps and electrification, there's going to be a big spike in demand on the grid. So it's kind of like we have to look at that building enclosure to improve that performance. So then those types of heat pumps and those systems can work efficiently without sort of, doing a high demand on the grid. And so, what we're trying to do a lot locally to, always keeping an eye on that, because some developers and owners, have that decarbonization, have that climate action plan as sort of goals. But you can always, again, like I said earlier, you can bring sort of practical approaches and, you can look at reducing risk related to water issues, air tightness and things like that with like, how could we use some of the stuff and improve energy performance, improve the durability and resiliency aspects from project to project, using the building enclosure as that sort of stage.
I guess kind of building on that too, when you think about this industry, what excites you most? What are you most hopeful for?
I'm hopeful for, like, the great thing about it is that each project, from a building enclosure perspective, they almost try to outdo each other, right? Like, hey, we did it this way the last time. Could we get more efficient from, whether they have an embodied carbon goal, energy efficiency goal, things like that, use of materials. There's new materials coming on, in the market all the time. It wasn't too long ago that, the only thermally broken, assembly type out there was windows, curtain walls, things like that, right? Now you can get thermally broken balconies, right? You can get a lot of these things. So, the improvements, in technology as well as material choices and material performance, but then also, I really think moving forward, using sort of the passive house mentality is where a lot of codes are moving to. And I think a lot of the building types, regardless of it's existing or new, bringing sort of that mentality forward, that passive, looking to prioritizing passive strategies instead of just sort of the mechanical efficiencies, or just like, hey, we'll be efficient by just using LEDs, right? Like moving away from that mentality, looking at increasing passive survivability, which leads to, not just energy efficiency, things like that, but just more durability, making occupants within the building a lot more healthy related to that, making the buildings a lot more resilient.
Well, we spent all this time talking about you professionally, but lastly, I do want to ask, maybe on a lighter note, after a long week of advancing the industry, how do you like to unwind and recharge?
I mean, being based in Bend, Oregon doesn't hurt, being so close to nature. I'm a very avid, mountain biker, skier, hiker, paddleboard, anything outdoors. So it's very easy to sort of, that reconnection with nature and how easy it is to get to it from here, really recharges the batteries, makes you reflect on everything, and just, puts a huge smile on your face when you're flying down the mountain, whether it's on a bike or skis. It's hard not to smile and enjoy yourself with that.
Well, thank you again, Steve, for your time today, and congratulations again.
Yeah, thank you, Lindsay.
If anyone sees Steven out in the industry, be sure to congratulate him. Until next time, visit us on buildingenclosureonline.com for your technical and educational resources.